Ah, winter, the magical season of snowball fights and cozy nights by the fire. But snow can hide far darker secrets. These 4 winter stories of unexpected horrors aren't for the faint of heart. So bundle up, because the cold won't be the only thing that will chill you to the bone. It was just after the holidays, when I was 9, when my family drove out from Green Bay to visit Grandpa for his birthday. He lived on a sprawling piece of rural property, on snow-covered fields that were once a dairy farm, bordered by woods, and the quiet that comes with being miles from the nearest neighbor. His house was cozy and warm, but what always fascinated me as a kid was the little cabin on the far end of the property. It wasn't much, just a glorified shed, really, but it had a tiny kitchenette, a single bed, and a little table and chair. It always seemed like the kind of place that could hold secrets. When Grandma was alive, this is where he'd process the deer he hunted in the woods. Grandma wasn't a fan of seeing them draining for hours. When I was very little, I remember playing near the cabin and backing mindlessly into a hanging deer my grandpa had shot. I remember turning to see its chest cavity pried wide open, a metal rod shoved in its chest, a large trough below it to catch the blood. Its limbs were extended wide, suspended in silence. My young brain short-circuited, overwhelmed with seeing for the first time what was inside a living being. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. On that winter birthday, while the adults were inside eating cake and talking over coffee, I decided to bundle up and play outside. It started with the usual snow games, building a snowman, making snow angels, and tossing snowballs at anything I could reach. But soon I found myself wandering further away from the house, my boots crunching through the fresh snow. The little cabin came into view, standing silently at the edge of the woods. But for some reason, it looked different to me. The door, which was usually shut tight, was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible against the bright snow. The wind had blown a fine layer of snow through the opening, and it had gathered just inside the doorway. I had no framework to think I shouldn't push it in, and I wanted a break from the cold wind. I stepped inside, pushing the door open fully. It creaked loudly, and the sound seemed to echo in the stillness. The air inside was still bitterly cold, and the little cabin looked disheveled. The small table by the closet was knocked over, and the chair was lying on its side. This didn't look right. Grandpa was an organized man, and wouldn't have left it like this. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had blown the door open, or a raccoon or some other animal had come inside. I set the table upright and looked around. Even the bed was messy. The blankets wadded up at the foot of the bed and looked stained and dirty with something dark brown. The kitchenette was untouched, except for an empty vodka bottle. Grandpa didn't drink as far as I knew. My eyes kept drifting back to the plain wooden closet door. Something about it made me uneasy, but I also wanted to look inside. Unable to stop myself, I reached for the closet handle and opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. There was a bundle of something dark and bulky at the bottom of the closet. Then the smell hit me, faint but unmistakable, the sickly sweet odor of decay. My stomach turned as I realized what I was seeing. A body folded awkwardly into that small space. The skin was gray and blotchy, frozen in some places and decomposing in others. The face was partially hidden, but what I could see was contorted as if caught in mid-scream. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to close the door, to unsee the man folded into an unnatural shape, to escape the tiny cabin and the horrifying secret that I'd stumbled upon. I turned and bolted from the cabin, slipping in the snow, but managing to catch myself. By the time I reached the house, I was breathless and crying. My parents and Grandpa rushed to me, alarmed by my panic, and as I tried to explain, tripping over my words, I finally managed to blurt out what I'd seen. Grandpa's face went pale, and he immediately called the police. It didn't take long for the officers to arrive, their cars crunching through the snow-covered driveway. They cordoned off the area and entered the cabin. When they came back, their faces were serious. The man in the closet had been dead for more than a few days, possibly even weeks. They found signs of a struggle, a broken chair leg, scuffs marks on the floor, and some bloodstains on the bed, but no clear answers about who the man was or how he had ended up there. Grandpa was questioned extensively. He explained that he barely used the cabin anymore, especially in the winter, and he had no idea anyone had even been there. The police speculated that someone might have been living in the cabin, squatting there without Grandpa knowing. The signs of a struggle suggested that the man had been attacked, possibly by someone who was also staying there. Grandpa boarded up the cabin after that, and it was empty for years. Every time we visited, I couldn't help feeling drawn to it, imagining the terrible secret it had once held. Even now, as an adult, I can't drive past an old cabin or shed without feeling dread. I grew up in the country where life was simple and routine. My mom taught at the local elementary school, and my dad managed our small farm. Our days were filled with chores, meals together, and the occasional adventure. We had a handful of animals: cows, goats, and a horse, Finn. He was a chestnut gelding with a gentle spirit and an eagerness for the trails that crisscrossed the back country behind our property. When my chores were done, I'd saddle up Finn and ride the trails for hours. I loved the solitude, the crunch of his hooves on the earth, and the way the woods seemed alive even in the desolation of winter. My parents had one rule: stay close to the farm and never cross the creek that bordered our property. I'd always assumed their warning was about safety. The creek was wide and the water icy and fast in the winter. But I was young and curious, and on more than one occasion I crossed the creek, never going too far, but enough to explore the forbidden side. It was strange to look back across the creek from the other side and see our property like a stranger would. It was one cold winter day when I found the old pillowcase. Snow blanketed the forest that day, muffling sounds and making everything seem still. Finn and I had crossed the creek and were following its edge on the far bank when I saw it, an oddly shaped yellow pillowcase, half buried in the snow. I didn't even know what it was when I first saw it, but the stark contrast of the yellow fabric and the snow stood out unnaturally. I didn't think twice about hopping off in to investigate. The sack was wrinkled at the top, like it had been tied at one point, but now the contents peeked out. A gray plush rabbit toy, its fur matted and stained, was half sticking out from the opening. It looked old and sad, like it had been loved but then lost. Something about the rabbit made me want to see more, so I pulled at the top of the dirty fabric and peered inside. Alongside the rabbit was an old, threadbare blanket, a pair of small, scuffed My Little Pony winter boots, and a folded piece of paper. I reached for the paper first. It was a drawing. A child's sketch of a little girl sitting in a room with a small, glowing lamp. The girl in the picture wasn't smiling. Her expression was very sad. What caught my attention most, though, was the rabbit. It was there in the drawing, too, clutched in her arms. In the bottom right corner of the picture, a name was written in a child's handwriting. McKenna. I tucked the rabbit and the drawing into my coat and rode back home as fast as Finn could carry me. By the time I got back, my mom had just come home from school. She gave me a big hug, but her expression quickly changed when she saw what I was holding. Her face went pale as I showed her the rabbit and the drawing. She didn't say much at first, just stared at the name on the corner of the picture. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Where did you find this?" I didn't want to get in trouble for crossing the creek, but I told her everything. The yellow pillowcase and what I'd found inside. Her reaction scared me. She grabbed the phone and called the police immediately, her hands trembling as she explained what I'd found. Only then did she tell me about McKenna. McKenna had been one of my mom's first-grade students. She'd gone missing last year, vanishing on her way home from school. The whole town had been searching for her, but they still hadn't found her. The drawing sealed it. Mom had always insisted that her students put their names in the bottom right corner of their work, and this was undeniably the McKenna of my mom's class. When the police arrived, they took the rabbit and the drawing. Mom told them everything she knew about McKenna and where I'd found the bag. The officers asked if we'd ever had trouble with our neighbor Kevin across the creek. We hadn't, but the question sent a chill down my spine. The guy who lived there kept to himself. He lived alone and was rarely seen in town. Rumors had floated around about him for years, nothing concrete, just whispers. The police investigated his property, and what they found made my stomach churn. Inside his house, they discovered more drawings like the one in the pillowcase, along with several small toys and pieces of clothing that McKenna's parents later identified as hers. I was a kid then, and didn't understand what had happened, just that Kevin went to prison and his house was vacant for years after that day. Now, whenever a storm hits, I remember that yellow pillowcase, left carelessly in the snow as though its contents didn't matter. And I think about our neighbor, the quiet man across the creek, and how close he had been all along. McKenna herself has never been found. Growing up outside of Rochester, New York, winters meant endless hours of sledding, snowball fights, and trudging through thick, powdery snowdrifts. We lived for it. Even when the snowstorms came down heavy and fast, it was just part of life. The winter I turned 11, we had a snowstorm that was particularly bad, with thick, swirling flurries that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead of you. But it didn't matter to me or my friends Wayne and Derek. We weren't about to let a little weather stop us from testing our brand new disc sleds. Wayne had this idea to hike through the woods to the tallest hill in the area. It was a spot we all called High Point. It was notorious for its steep drop-off, just at the edge of some dense woods. The climb was brutal in the snow, but we were kids, invincible and reckless. Derek volunteered to go first, practically launching himself down the slope before Wayne and I had even gotten our sleds positioned. The hill was slick, and he shot down like a bullet, quickly disappearing from view as the terrain curved and dipped. We were still fumbling with our sleds when Derek's distant screams reached us. It wasn't laughter or excitement. It was something else. Wayne and I froze, looking at each other, momentarily unsure of what to do before scrambling down after him. The snow was thick, and we kept stumbling and sliding as we descended. Halfway down, we found Derek standing in the middle of the slope, his face pale, his breath coming in gulps. He was shouting something, but his words were jumbled, barely making sense. He said something about slamming into it. Finally, he pointed down toward where his sled had stopped, his hand red and trembling. I'll never forget what we saw when we got there. His sled was tipped over near a large black trash bag that was almost entirely buried under the snow. At first, it just looked like garbage someone had tossed in the woods. But when I saw the tears in the bag, small, jagged holes where something gray and wrinkled jutted out, it took a second for my brain to process what it was. A toe. A human toe. The skin was mottled and frostbitten, and the nail was cracked and dirty. I remember feeling my stomach lurch as my eyes darted to the crows circling overhead. They swooped down, landing near the bag. One of them began pecking at the opening. Derek doubled over and started vomiting behind me, the sound making my knees weak. Wayne was completely still, his mouth wide open in shock. "We need to go." My voice barely audible over the wind. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. They didn't argue. We bolted, running as fast as we could through the woods, our boots slipping on the icy patches as branches snagged at our jackets. By the time we reached Derek's house, we were breathless and frostbitten. His mom took one look at us and knew something was wrong. Still breathless, we tried to explain what we'd found, all of us talking over each other. At first, she didn't seem to believe us. But when Derek started crying, she got serious and called the police. The officers arrived about half an hour later. They questioned us briefly before heading out toward High Point with their heavy snow gear. We stayed behind, of course, huddled in Derek's living room with mugs of hot chocolate we couldn't bring ourselves to drink. When the cops returned, their faces were grim. They told Derek's mom what they'd found, but we overheard enough to piece it all together. The area around the bag had been disturbed. Tracks in the snow, scuffs where something heavy had been dragged. There were also fresh tire marks leading away from the woods, disappearing onto the road that bordered the trees. Whatever had been in that bag was gone, leaving only some torn scraps of a trash bag and lots of questions. The police suspected we'd interrupted someone in the middle of whatever they were doing. The thought of it made my skin crawl. I kept replaying it in my head. The open bag, the gray toe, the crows pecking at it. Whoever had left that body there had probably been watching us from the woods. I still wonder if we'd interrupted the killer dumping the body, or if they'd come back to get it for some reason. Forensics came up with nothing, and the case remains open. I'm in my 30s now, and the image of that discarded bag, partially covered in the snow, still haunts me. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I planned a cozy ski trip getaway. A long weekend in the mountains, secluded from everything in the dead of winter. It sounded perfect, until his boss needed him to stay and complete a project that was nearing its deadline. He had to stay behind. It was too late to cancel and not lose our deposit on the rental, so I decided to go alone. I needed the break from work, and the little cabin in the woods would still be relaxing. When I arrived, the owner, an older woman named Charlotte, greeted me warmly. She lived in another cabin through the woods behind the rental. She seemed nice enough, and we made small talk about the weather and the local ski trails. She told me she wouldn't bother me except for having the front porch shoveled, but she was nearby if I needed anything else at all. She handed me the keys and left me to settle in. The cabin was really nice, just like in the website pictures, rustic but with modern conveniences, and a roaring fireplace in the living room, a smaller one in the cozy bedroom. On the first night, I was exhausted and went to bed early, but despite being tired, I had a hard time sleeping. When you're in an unfamiliar place, it can be hard to fall asleep, and I noticed how much the cabin creaked and groaned. I figured that was normal for an older wooden structure and eventually fell off to sleep. But when I woke up the next morning and sat up from the warm, cozy comforter, I looked to my suitcase. And to my confusion, it wasn't where I'd left it. I distinctly remembered placing it by the wall on the suitcase stand because I hated using furniture in rentals. Now it was open in the middle of the room, on the floor, with some of my clothes spilled all around. Annoyed, I blamed myself. Maybe I'd been so tired I'd forgotten to put it back on the stand. Shaking it off, I grabbed my ski gear and headed out for the day. When I got back to the cabin, I found the bedroom fireplace lit. The flames crackled warmly, filling the small, cozy space with heat. For a moment, I smiled, assuming this was a thoughtful touch from Charlotte. But then I remembered she'd said she wouldn't come by unless I needed something. The fire was roaring, so it had to have been lit recently. It didn't make sense. But the only reasonable explanation was that Charlotte had been there. I checked on my things. Again, my suitcase was open, but it was still on the suitcase stand. I didn't remember zipping it, so maybe I'd left it open. I just couldn't remember. With a quick check, I didn't think anything was missing. As a special vacation treat, I'd brought a box of croissants for breakfast. But the following morning, when I reached into the bakery box, I was shocked to find it was empty. I knew for a fact that I still had a few in there the night before. I hadn't counted them when I'd bought them, and maybe the bakery had shorted me on my order. That night, I woke up shivering. The cabin was freezing cold, and I quickly realized why. The front door was ajar. It wasn't wide open, just cracked enough to let the cold air seep in. My heart thudded as I stepped closer to inspect it. I was certain I'd locked it before bed. I'm one to check those things, and I was sure. Peering outside, I saw nothing but freshly fallen snow. There were no footprints in the white blanket of snow at all, and near the door the walkways were shoveled and salted clean. I locked the door and checked the tiny cabin, but everything seemed fine. I must have left it unlocked for the wind to blow it open. My nerves were shot. By the third day, I was ready to confront Charlotte about her coming into the cabin. I bundled up to take the path through the trees to her house, but as I rounded the back of my cabin, I froze. A trail of footprints, faint but visible, led from the woods off the path to the rear of the cabin. My stomach churned. I followed the tracks to a small half door I hadn't seen before, located at the base of the cabin. The snow in front of the door had been recently shoved aside, letting it open easily. I don't know why I did it. I really wasn't thinking at the moment. I was too shocked and curious and tromped right through the snow to the low door. Slowly, I pulled open the little door. A musty, damp smell hit me immediately. Inside, a narrow crawl space extended under the bedroom. It was bright enough outside to see a dirt floor, and to my horror, a makeshift setup, a sleeping bag, some bottles filled with yellow liquid and food wrappers, and my underwear. Someone had been living there. Suddenly, in the shadow of the back of the crawl space, movement caught my eye. A man in his 30s, scruffy and wild-eyed, scrambled toward the door, pushing right past me as he ran into the woods. I stood there, paralyzed, my heart pounding in my ears. I ran back inside and called the police immediately. When they arrived, they searched the crawl space and found evidence that the man had been there for some time. He'd likely been sneaking into the cabin through the half door while I was out or asleep. There was a peephole in the floor through which he could clearly see the bed. The idea of him watching me from beneath the bedroom sent chills down my spine. I realized the lit fireplace would give him a better view of me in that room when the lights were off. I was disgusted. While they continued their search, Charlotte arrived, her face pale and drawn, and she clutched her coat tightly around her as the officers explained what they'd found. As they spoke, I noticed her expression shifted. Not surprise, but dread. Before they could say much more, Charlotte pulled me aside, her hands trembling. "It's my son," she said in a whisper, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I don't know why he was staying under there." I stared at her, stunned. "Your son?" Her eyes darted nervously toward the officers. "He's been having such a rough time. He was supposed to shovel the snow around the property for me. That's it. I thought he was going home every night, but I guess—" She trailed off, her face crumpling. "Charlotte, he was inside the cabin while I slept. He went through my things, took my clothes, ate my food. He was watching me." She winced, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please, you don't understand. If you report this, he'll go back to jail again. He's been in and out of trouble his whole life, but he's not dangerous. He's just lost." Her words made my stomach churn. The thought of him lurking under the house while I slept, creeping inside when I wasn't looking, was beyond disturbing. "He could have hurt me, Charlotte, or worse. I can't just let this go." "I don't think he'd hurt anyone again. I swear, he doesn't think straight sometimes around women. He just likes you. Please, I'm begging you, don't ruin our lives over this." I stepped back, overwhelmed by a mix of anger and disbelief. But before I could respond, one of the officers stepped in. She'd heard the whole thing. They were still questioning Charlotte as I packed my stuff. Days later, as I replayed everything in my mind, it wasn't just her son's actions that freaked me out. It was Charlotte's reaction, too. The way she'd begged and tried to excuse his behavior as though it was just a minor inconvenience. I wondered how long she'd known about him and how much of his behavior she'd covered up. These long winter nights just got a little colder, didn't they? As the snow blankets the world in quiet isolation, it's easy to forget what might be hiding out there in the silence. Have you ever discovered something terrifying like these people did? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss my next set of scary stories. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, and remember, there could be something waiting out there in the snow far scarier than these dark winter nights. You should check out my store. There's some prints and mugs and clothes and all kinds of fun things that you might enjoy. There's a link here in the description as well. You can also scan the QR code. It's another way to support me, and I appreciate it. Thanks very much.